They always tell you that being called a brother by the girl you love is supposed to be sweet, a safe zone title. But let me tell you what it really feels like. It's the sound of a door closing so softly, you almost convince yourself it's still open. My name's Ethan Cole, 27, living in Portland, and for years I believed that being Mia Harper's brother was enough to keep the loneliness quiet, enough to make the world feel less empty. But I was wrong. So wrong that it took another woman walking into my life to show me how deep that illusion ran. I met Mia freshman year of college, both of us late for philosophy class, both clutching coffees like shields, and she bumped into me so hard the lid popped off and splashed over my notes. And instead of apologizing, she laughed and said, "Guess the universe didn't want you to learn about Plato today." And I laughed too, because how do you stay mad at someone whose smile looks like an inside joke you're already part of? From that day on, she became gravity. We did group projects, midnight diners, bad poetry readings, everything two broke students do to pretend life is under control. When she called me her best friend, it felt like a metal pin to my chest. And when she said, "You're like the brother I never had," I smiled and said, "Yeah, always," even though something in my chest cracked like thin ice. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. We texted constantly. We finished each other's sentences. She cried on my shoulder after breakups. And every time she said, "Why can't all guys be like you?" It took everything in me not to shout. They could be, if you'd just look at me. But I didn't shout. I stayed quiet, the good friend, the safe harbor, the constant. College blurred by in caffeine and deadlines. And after graduation, we both ended up in Portland. Because of course we did. We couldn't imagine not living 5 blocks apart. I worked as a UX designer at a small startup, and she became a copywriter for some digital agency that specialized in making soda sound meaningful. We'd meet every Friday at a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and second chances, and she'd talk about her chaotic coworkers, her failed Tinder dates, and I'd nod and laugh and give advice like an emotional mechanic fixing engines I'd never get to drive. There were nights we'd end up on my couch watching movies, her head on my shoulder, and she'd mumble, "You're my favorite person, Ethan." And I'd whisper, "You too, Mia." Because that's what brothers do, right? They whisper love like it's platonic oxygen. I told myself I was fine, that being needed was enough, that proximity was love in disguise. But deep down, I was living on breadcrumbs of attention and calling it a feast. Then last spring, everything shifted. I met Lena Morales at my friend Ryan's birthday. And from the second she said, "You're standing on my purse, stranger," with that half smile like she'd caught me trespassing, I knew my script was about to change. Lena was grounded where Mia was restless, calm where Mia was chaos. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn someone's interest. It was just there, effortless. We talked for hours that night, about work, travel, childhood weirdness. And when she laughed, she leaned forward like she actually wanted to catch the sound coming out of my mouth. I walked her to her car, and she said, "If you're this funny sober, you owe me a coffee sometime." And I said, "Name the place." And she said, "Surprise me." And I swear the air around us felt like a reset button. Our first date was at this plant-filled cafe on Alberta Street where they serve coffee strong enough to fix bad decisions. And she listened, really listened, like every word mattered. When I told her about my design job, she said, "So you make confusion look pretty." And I laughed. "That's basically it." And she said, "Then we're opposites. I make chaos sound smart." And that's when I realized how easy it could be to connect when it isn't tangled in old debts of affection. After a few weeks of dates, late-night texts, and slow mornings, Lena became a quiet constant. Not a storm, not a rescue, just peace. And I didn't know peace could be so intoxicating. I told Mia about Lena one night over tacos, expecting excitement. But her eyes flickered like someone had dimmed the room, and she said, "Wow, that's fast." I shrugged. "Yeah, but it feels right." And she said, "Good for you." In that voice people use when they're saying something else entirely. She started asking weirdly specific questions. Is she funny? What does she look like? Do you really like her? Or is this a rebound? And I laughed it off because I thought she was just protective, but deep down something in her tone unsettled me. When I told her Lena wanted to meet her, she said, "Sure, why not?" and changed the subject. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. The day of the brunch came. Bright Saturday morning, the kind where Portland pretends it's California for 5 minutes. And I was more nervous than I wanted to admit. Mia arrived first, in a yellow dress that looked like sunlight bottled, and she hugged me a little too long, saying, "There's my favorite guy." And I laughed. "Not for long. Someone's about to challenge your title." She smiled tight and said, "We'll see." Lena showed up a few minutes later, wearing denim and confidence, and she shook Mia's hand and said, "I've heard so much about you." And Mia replied, "I bet you have," with a smile sharp enough to slice through politeness. We sat down and ordered pancakes, and the conversation started light. Work stories, travel dreams, harmless jokes. But underneath it, there was a current, subtle but strong. Mia kept steering things back to old memories. Remember when we drove to Cannon Beach and got lost? Remember how we used to cook together every Sunday? Remember when you said we'd always have each other? And Lena just smiled, patient, graceful, like someone watching a play she already knew the ending of. I felt torn in half. Part of me proud of how natural Lena was. Part of me uneasy at how territorial Mia sounded. At one point, Mia leaned over and said, "Ethan, tell her about the time we crashed that wedding." And Lena laughed. "You crashed a wedding?" And Mia said, "Yeah, we were unstoppable." And the word we hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. I tried to defuse it with humor. "We were dumb college kids." But Mia just looked at me and said softly, "We were happy." And I swear Lena caught it. That flicker of something unspoken, because her smile faltered for the first time. The rest of brunch blurred. I paid. Everyone smiled, but the air was heavier than syrup. When Lena excused herself to take a call outside, Mia leaned in and said, "She's nice." And I said, "She is." And Mia added, "A little perfect, though." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged. "Nothing, just, you usually go for chaos, not spreadsheets." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I'm growing up." And she looked at me like that was the saddest punchline she'd ever heard. When Lena came back, Mia stood and hugged her goodbye with a too sweet smile. "It was great meeting you." And Lena said, "You too." And as we walked out, Mia whispered, "Don't disappear on me, okay?" And I said, "I'm not disappearing. I'm just living." And she said, "Same thing lately," then smiled and walked away before I could answer. That night, Lena and I cooked dinner at my place, and she was quiet for a while before asking, "How long have you and Mia been this close?" I sighed, "Forever, I guess." And she said, "You know she still thinks she's the center of your orbit, right?" I said, "It's not like that." And she smiled sadly, "Not for you maybe." And I didn't know how to respond because part of me already knew she was right. Over the next week, Mia started texting more, calling at odd hours, sending memes about friendship and missing our talks. And every time I tried to pull back, she'd rope me in with nostalgia. Lena noticed, of course, and I felt torn between loyalty and guilt, between past and future. One evening, after a long day, I found Mia waiting outside my building with takeout, smiling like nothing had changed, and she said, "Thought we could have our old movie night." And I hesitated. Because inside Lena was waiting with wine and a new recipe, and I said, "I can't tonight, Mia. I already have plans." And she blinked. "With her?" And I said, "Yeah." And she laughed. "Wow, you really are gone, huh?" And I said, "I'm not gone. I'm just trying to balance things." And she said, "Balance is boring." And I said, "Maybe boring's what I need." And her face twisted into something I'd never seen. Not anger exactly, but disbelief, like she couldn't fathom a world where she wasn't my priority. She handed me the takeout and said, "For when you get tired of perfect," then walked off before I could say a word. I stood there under the buzzing streetlight, holding 2 paper bags of cooling noodles, realizing that for the first time in years, I hadn't chased after her. That night, I told Lena everything. The years of friendship, the brother line, the confusion, and she just listened, then said, "You deserve to be someone's choice, not someone's safety net." And I swear that sentence rewired something in my brain. The next morning, Mia texted, "Can we talk?" And I stared at it for a long time before typing, "Not tonight." She replied, "Since when do you say no to me?" And I didn't answer, because maybe that was the whole problem. I never had. For days, the silence between us stretched, and I thought maybe that was it, the quiet death of whatever weird orbit we'd built. But then she showed up again, smiling too bright, saying, "I'm happy for you, really," and hugging me so tight I couldn't breathe, whispering, "Don't forget me, okay?" And I said, "Never, sis." And the word came out steady, final, like a door clicking shut at last, though neither of us realized yet just how much it would echo. After that brunch, something between Mia and me cracked like glass under slow pressure. You couldn't see the break, but you could feel the edges. It started with harmless texts. "Miss you. We never hang out anymore." And I answered out of habit because that's what you do when someone once called you their favorite person. But soon it was late-night calls, inside jokes resurfacing, and comments about Lena wrapped in sugar but sharp underneath. She seems organized. Or so this is the girl who stole my brother. Lena noticed, of course. She's too smart not to. But she stayed calm, only saying, "You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that kept you small." I tried to believe that, but part of me still flinched every time Mia's name lit up my phone. One Friday, she called crying, "Can you come over?" And I went, because old reflexes die slower than love. But when I got there, she wasn't crying, just lonely. She smiled through tears that weren't there and said, "I hate when you're too busy for me." And I said, "I'm not too busy. I'm just not yours." And she froze like the words had never dared leave my mouth before. We watched a movie in silence, and halfway through she whispered, "Remember when it was just us?" And I said, "Yeah, but it isn't anymore." And she said, "You changed." And I said, "Maybe I finally did." The next days, she went radio silent except for Instagram stories with captions like, "Funny how people move on." And some promises mean nothing. And I felt the guilt crawl up even though I'd done nothing wrong. Lena told me, "She's not losing a friend. She's losing control." And that sentence sat heavy in my chest because it sounded exactly right. Then came Ryan's birthday, the same bar where I'd met Lena months before, and Mia showed up uninvited, smiling like she owned the room. "Ethan," she shouted, wrapping me in a hug too tight. "Didn't know you'd be here." And I said, "It's Ryan's birthday." And she smirked. "And you brought your plus one," throwing a glance at Lena sharp enough to cut glass. The night spiraled fast, Mia drinking too much, retelling old stories about our adventures, and calling me my brother, loud enough for everyone to hear. Lena stood beside me, calm but stiff, and when Mia toasted, "To the people who never leave," Lena's hand slipped out of mine. I tried to take Mia outside, but she laughed. "Oh, relax. Can't I joke with my best friend?" And I said, "You're not joking. You're crossing lines." And she said, "You didn't mind the lines before." And there it was, truth wrapped in venom. I stepped outside to breathe, and Lena followed, eyes bright but cold. "She told me you two almost happened once. Is that true?" And I said, "No, we never did." And she said, "But you wanted to." And I didn't answer, because silence was safer than the wrong kind of honesty. Lena shook her head. "You can't build something new while someone else is still living in the ruins." And she left before I could speak. I went back inside to find Mia on the small stage near the bar with a mic in her hand, tipsy and glowing like a warning flare. "You know what's funny?" she told the crowd. "When your best friend gets a girlfriend, and suddenly you're the crazy one." People laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a bit, but my heart stopped. I pushed through the crowd and said, "Mia, get down." And she grinned. "Why embarrassed?" And I said, "This isn't you." And she said, "Maybe it always was." She dropped the mic and stormed past me, muttering, "Have fun with your perfect girl." And I just stood there, surrounded by strangers pretending not to stare. Outside, the air was cold, and the city sounded too alive for how hollow I felt. Lena texted, "I'm going home," and I replied, "I'll call tomorrow." But she didn't answer. That night, I sat on my couch scrolling through years of photos of Mia and me. Concerts, beaches, birthdays, realizing how long I'd been orbiting someone who never planned to land. The next morning, Mia texted, "Sorry if I went too far." And I wrote back, "You didn't go too far. You went somewhere I can't follow." She replied, "You'll miss me." And I said, "I already did, years ago." Then I turned off my phone, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace trying to be born in a room that had finally been cleared of ghosts. 3 weeks passed before I saw Mia again, and by then the air between us had turned into something heavy enough to choke on. Lena and I were trying to move forward. Dinners, laughter, quiet mornings. But there was always a ghost at the table, a ghost with brown eyes and perfect timing. Mia sent me messages that started normal and ended strange. "Hope you're doing okay. I miss us. Remember when we didn't need anyone else?" And I didn't reply because every word felt like a hook, and I was tired of bleeding for nostalgia. One night she showed up outside my apartment unannounced, hair wet from the rain, mascara smudged like war paint, clutching a takeout bag like it was a peace offering. "Can we talk?" she said, voice trembling just enough to sound human again. I hesitated but stepped aside, because I always did, and she walked in, dripping heartbreak on my rug, smelling like the past, and bad timing. "You've been avoiding me," she said, setting the food down. "I just wanted to see you." and I said, Mia, you didn't want to see me. You wanted to make sure I still see you. And she flinched because the truth always lands like a slap. She paced my living room, eyes wild. You replaced me. And I said, I didn't replace you. I grew up. And she shouted, you don't just outgrow people. And I said, no, but you outgrow versions of yourself that depend on being someone else's favorite. Her voice cracked. So what am I now? And I said, someone I used to love the wrong way. And she froze, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. You loved me, she whispered. And I said, yeah, but not enough to keep losing myself. For a moment, everything was silent except the rain tapping the windows like it wanted to clap for finally being honest. She sat down, trembling. I thought we'd always be us. And I said, we are, just not the way you want anymore. And she started crying, ugly, loud, raw, the kind of crying that sounds like confession. I handed her a tissue, not out of pity but habit, because that's what I'd always done. Fix, comfort, absorb. She looked at me through tears. You really love her? And I said, yes. And she said, is she better than me? And I said, she's not competing with you, Mia. She just loves me without trying to own me. She laughed bitterly. Guess I was always the villain in your story. And I said, no, you were just human. So was I. We both stayed too long in a friendship that wasn't one anymore. Then she stood, voice small again. I don't know how to be without you. And I said, you'll learn. We both will. And she nodded like she hated the sound of acceptance. When she finally left, she hugged me once, too long, and whispered, goodbye, brother. And this time I didn't correct her. I just whispered, goodbye, sister. Because maybe the only way to let go is to bury the ghost with the name it gave itself. After that night, I didn't hear from her for months. Not a text, not a sighting, just silence. And for the first time in years, it didn't hurt. It just existed. Lena stayed, patient, kind, real. And one evening while cooking dinner, she said, do you still think about her? And I said, sometimes, but it's more like remembering who I was, not who she is. And she smiled. That's what healing sounds like. And I laughed. Then it's the loudest thing I've ever heard. Weeks later, while scrolling online, I stumbled on one of Mia's new posts, a photo of her hiking, smiling genuinely, captioned, some people aren't chapters, they're lessons. And I didn't feel anger, just a strange gratitude that maybe she finally found herself somewhere that didn't require me. Life went on quietly after that, which is the kind of peace you only notice once you've lived inside chaos. Lena and I moved in together the next spring, small apartment, too many plants, not enough storage, but it felt like home, the kind that doesn't depend on fixing anyone. Sometimes I'd walk past the old cafe where Mia and I used to sit for hours, and I'd see other pairs laughing over coffee, and I'd smile because someone else was learning what I already knew. That love dressed as friendship can still leave bruises when you hug it too hard. Months later, out of nowhere, I got one last text from Mia, just 5 words. Thank you for growing up. And I typed back, thank you for letting me. And that was it, the end of a story that should have ended years ago, but needed time to understand itself. People ask if we ever became friends again, and the answer is no, because some bridges don't need rebuilding. They need to stay gone so you remember why you crossed the river in the first place. Now when I think of her, I don't feel ache. I feel distance, like watching lightning miles away. Beautiful, untouchable, dangerous only if you forget how far you've come. Sometimes Lena teases me when I zone out. Hey, Earth to Ethan, and I smile. Just visiting old ghosts. And she says, tell them they don't pay rent anymore. And we laugh, because maybe that's all healing really is, laughing at the echoes instead of living in them. And if you ask me how it feels now, after all of it, the years of being the brother, the confessions that never happened, the heartbreak disguised as loyalty, I'll tell you it feels like breathing after years underwater. Because the truth is, Mia didn't break me. She revealed the cracks I kept pretending weren't there, and Lena didn't save me. She just handed me a mirror and said, you can step out now. And I did. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the fireworks, not the revenge, not the dramatic speech, just peace, quiet, and a name I can finally say without flinching. So yeah, she'll always be part of my story. But now when I think of her, I don't think of love or loss or what if. I just think, she's my sister. And this time, it doesn't hurt to mean it. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.